It was late May 1944 when Oberleutnant Fredo Ebeling stood in the observation bunker at Pointe de Hoc, perched on the Normandy coast. His binoculars swept across the landscape before him, taking in the limestone cliffs that dropped dramatically to the narrow beach below, a near-vertical wall of stone rising 100 feet from the water's edge. The morning mist rolled across the English Channel, thick enough to hide the horizon entirely, obscuring the exact moment when Allied ships would materialize and the invasion would begin. Behind him, young gunners moved through their morning duties without apparent concern. They belonged to the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260, confident in the fortress they served and the unforgiving terrain that surrounded it. Ebeling lowered his binoculars and allowed himself a thin smile. The mathematics of warfare were on their side here. No army on Earth could scale these cliffs while under fire from above. The very physics of vertical assault made the position almost impossible to overcome. The confidence was rooted in cold calculation. 100 feet of sheer rock face meant exposed soldiers with nowhere to hide and nowhere to take cover. Machine gun positions spaced at strategic intervals would create overlapping zones of fire that left no gap in the defenses. The garrison numbered around 200 men, drawn from the 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions, veterans who knew their ground and their weapons. Minefields and barbed wire obstacles covered the approaches from inland. Every military principle suggested that this position was impregnable from the sea. The math was simple and brutal. Attackers would have 15 to 30 minutes or more of exposure while climbing, giving defenders adequate time to inflict staggering losses. This confidence was not new. When Wehrmacht engineers first surveyed these heights back in June 1940, just after France fell, they immediately recognized what they had found. A natural fortress with clear fields of observation stretching more than 12 miles in every direction. Coastal guns positioned here could devastate any amphibious landing within range. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel made his personal inspection on March 11, 1944, he recorded his assessment in the careful language of military precision. The natural cliffs provided superior defense to anything human engineering could construct, he noted. Enemy assault from the sea remained tactically impossible. By late 1942, 6 captured French 155mm guns had been emplaced atop the position. Each weapon could hurl a shell weighing 95 pounds across more than 20,000 yards of water. 4 of the guns sat in open concrete positions, while the other 2 were being encased in massive H671 casemates. Those formidable reinforced concrete structures built to withstand direct hits from battleship guns and aerial bombardment alike. The construction alone signaled absolute German conviction that this fortress would hold. By spring 1944, Pointe de Hoc had evolved into something more than a single fortification. It was a complex system designed to repel invasion from every conceivable direction. An observation bunker with panoramic sightlines across the landing beaches, multiple positions for anti-aircraft weapons, 30 anti-aircraft guns arrayed across the position, a network of interconnected trenches and tunnels running through the fortifications, ammunition magazines buried deep into the cliff face itself, and extensive minefields protecting every inland approach route. The garrison itself numbered approximately 210 men. Around 125 were infantrymen drawn from the 726th Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Infantry Division, while another 85 were artillerymen from the 2nd Battery and supporting elements of the 352nd Infantry Division held in reserve positions behind the main fortress. An officer assigned to defend the eastern approach had written to his wife just a week earlier, on May 28th, expressing the prevailing mood. His letter captured the certainty that permeated the garrison. This fortress represented the strongest position along the entire Atlantic Wall, he had written. Let the Americans attempt it if they dared. They would discover nothing but death on these rocks. Every defender understood that the cliff itself had become their greatest weapon, and no enemy force could overcome such terrain under fire. The Allied planners across the Channel saw the problem differently, but agreed on its severity. General Dwight Eisenhower and his staff at Supreme Headquarters in London had identified Point de Hoc as one of the most dangerous defensive positions anywhere on the Normandy coast. Those 6 guns, if they remained operational when the invasion began, could rain destruction across both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. A single battery firing with accuracy could sink landing craft, destroy tanks while they were still in the water, and transform the narrow beaches into killing grounds. The mathematics of the invasion demanded that these guns be eliminated before the main landings commenced. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army and responsible for the entire American assault sector, faced a decision that would trouble him for years. The cliffs were too high and too expertly defended for any conventional infantry approach. Paratroopers could potentially be dropped inland to attack from the rear, but the dense hedgerow terrain of Normandy made that uncertain at best. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment might damage the fortress, but those reinforced concrete casemates had been specifically designed to survive such attacks. Only one option appeared to offer genuine certainty of success, but it seemed to violate every basic principle of military tactics. A small force would need to land directly at the cliff base, climb the vertical face under enemy fire, and destroy the guns in close-quarters combat. When Bradley explained this mission to Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder on February 3, 1944, his discomfort was unmistakable. Rudder was a 34-year-old reserve officer from Brady, Texas, and he commanded the 2nd Battalion of Rangers, an elite unit of 545 men who had been specially trained for exactly these kinds of difficult assignments. Bradley leaned across the map table toward the younger officer and voiced what both men were thinking aloud. "This might prove to be the most dangerous mission of the entire invasion," he said quietly. "Naval officers have been telling me it cannot be done." One of them suggested that 3 old women with brooms could keep your Rangers from climbing those cliffs. Rudder studied the reconnaissance photographs spread before him, aerial images showing the harsh vertical walls rising from the narrow beach. He took in the gun emplacements, the observation bunker, the defensive positions arrayed along the cliff edge. Then he raised his eyes to meet Bradley's gaze. "My men can accomplish this, sir," he replied. The planning that followed was as unconventional as the mission itself. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Rangers, numbering approximately 225 men, would form Force A and assault Point de Hoc directly. They would be supported by the 5th Battalion of Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, designated as Force C, which would follow if the assault succeeded or redirect to Omaha Beach if it did not. The landing was set for 6:30 in the morning on D-Day, with naval gunfire support provided by the battleship USS Texas and destroyers USS Satterley and HMS Talibont. The challenge that consumed Rudder and his planning staff was deceptively simple yet seemingly insurmountable. How could men scale a 100-foot vertical cliff while defenders positioned at the summit attempted to kill them? The Rangers began intensive training in April 1944 on the cliffs near Swanage, along England's southern coast. British commandos, men who had survived coastal raids against German positions in both Norway and France, shared the hard lessons they had learned through bitter experience. The commandos had developed specialized equipment and techniques over years of trial and error, but they were brutally honest about the difficulties involved. "Climbing under fire bears no resemblance to mountain climbing," one British commando officer explained to a group of Rangers during a training session. "Your true opponent is not the rock itself, but rather the defender positioned at the summit trying to end your life. The only advantage you possess is speed, and even that advantage may prove insufficient." The Rangers tested every conceivable method of ascent and developed rocket-propelled grappling hooks as their primary equipment. A small rocket motor attached to a grapple and connected to rope could be fired from a launcher, sending the hook up and over the cliff edge where it would catch on rocks or other obstacles. Multiple ropes would create a climbing network. Through April and into May 1944, the Rangers practiced repeatedly on the Swanage Cliffs. First Sergeant Leonard Lamell, a 24-year-old from Point Pleasant Beach in New Jersey, who commanded D Company's 2nd Platoon, documented their progress in letters home. The repetition became obsessive. "We have climbed these cliffs so many times they visit me in my sleep," he wrote on April 23rd. Today we practiced using wet ropes because ours will be soaked when we exit the landing craft. They are treacherous as ice, and 2 men took falls, though fortunately neither was seriously injured. Tomorrow we will practice carrying full combat loads, 60 pounds of weapons and ammunition distributed across our bodies. The Rangers developed their own technique based on teamwork and speed. The strongest climber would go up first, moving quickly and carrying minimal weight, just a pistol or carbine, establishing a position at the summit to provide covering fire for those who followed. Other team members would ascend with the heavier weapons. The strongest soldiers were assigned to carry Browning automatic rifles. Each company received an allotment of 10 thermite grenades, specialized incendiary devices that burned at temperatures exceeding 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to destroy gun mechanisms and weld steel components together. Colonel Rudder addressed the mission directly in his final briefing on June 4, 1944, as the Rangers assembled for the crossing. The honesty of his words carried weight. "Gentlemen, I will not deceive you regarding what lies ahead," he began. "The Germans possess every conceivable advantage. They will be positioned above us, protected by fortifications, with clear fields of fire across our approach. We will be exposed on ropes, burdened with heavy equipment, with nowhere to conceal ourselves. Not all of us will reach the summit. Not all of us will survive this day. But I possess absolute certainty about one thing. If any military force on this earth possesses the capability to capture Pointe du Hoc, it is this battalion. We have prepared for this mission over 3 months. We understand the terrain, we have mastered our weapons, and we know each other completely. When we land on that beach, we will ascend those cliffs faster than the Germans believe humans can climb. We will reach the top before they can eliminate us all. And when we do reach the top, we will finish what we came to do. Those guns will be destroyed. The invasion will succeed. Are you prepared to do this?" The answer came immediately from all 225 throats, unified and loud. "Rangers lead the way, sir." The crossing of the English Channel began at 4:45 in the morning on June 6, 1944. Rangers climbed aboard their landing craft assault vessels in darkness and rough conditions, transferred from the transport ship HMS Amsterdam. Each LCA carried 22 men, 9 assault craft altogether for the primary force, with 2 additional craft carrying supplies and 4 DUKW amphibious vehicles equipped with 100-foot extension ladders salvaged from the London Fire Brigade. The sea was far rougher than anything they had experienced during training. Waves reached 5 to 6 feet high, and many Rangers suffered from violent seasickness in the confined, rocking spaces of their landing craft. Private First Class Harry Fate, a rifleman in E Company, later described the journey in vivid terms. "Before we had traveled 10 minutes from the transport ship, seawater was washing across us constantly. Spray swept over the low sides of the LCA relentlessly. Men vomited repeatedly, while others desperately bailed water to prevent the craft from sinking beneath us. Around us in the darkness stretched thousands of ships, the greatest naval armada ever assembled. At 5:50 in the morning, as the first light touched the eastern sky, the naval bombardment of Pointe du Hoc commenced. USS Texas, a battleship carrying 10 14-inch guns, opened fire from a position 10,000 yards offshore. Each massive shell weighed 1,400 pounds and screamed through the air overhead before smashing into the cliff top with earth-shaking force. Within precisely 34 minutes, USS Texas had fired 255 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc, maintaining an average rate of 7.5 shells each minute. The destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Taliban added their 5-inch guns to the relentless barrage. The Rangers, struggling through the rough seas in their landing craft, could see the cliff summit erupting repeatedly in enormous fountains of earth and pulverized concrete. But a critical error was already unfolding as the assault force approached the beach. In the darkness and general confusion, Lieutenant Colin Beaver of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, commanding the lead motor launch that was supposed to guide the assault force to the correct landing point, had navigated incorrectly. Instead of heading directly toward Pointe du Hoc, the flotilla was traveling parallel to the coast, steering toward Pointe de l'Airs, 3 miles to the eastward. First Sergeant Lamel was among the first to notice something was wrong. Looking through the spray at the cliff formations ahead, he recognized that the rock configuration did not match what they had memorized. He scrambled across the crowded landing craft to reach the British coxswain. "That's not our objective," Lamel shouted over the roar of the engine noise. "We're traveling the wrong direction." As other men began to recognize the error as well, Lieutenant Beaver finally acknowledged his mistake and ordered the flotilla to change course. But valuable time had been squandered. The assault, which had been scheduled to land at H-hour at 6:30 in the morning, would not reach the beach until after 7 o'clock. This 40-minute delay meant the Rangers would climb in bright daylight rather than the partial concealment of early dawn. Additionally, with 40 minutes having elapsed since the naval bombardment ended, German defenders would have sufficient time to recover from the shock of the bombardment and resume their defensive positions. Company C of the 2nd Rangers, which had been assigned to assault Point de l'Erce, landed correctly at their objective at approximately 6:40 in the morning. Captain Ralph Goranson led 70 men up those cliffs and secured their objective, but they were now isolated from the main assault force by 3 miles of enemy-controlled coastline. Meanwhile, the 4th Rangers and the 5th Ranger Battalion, which had been stationed offshore waiting for the signal that Point de Hoc had fallen, never received that signal. Following their orders, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider made the difficult decision to redirect his force toward Omaha Beach instead. The original strategy had called for 500 men to arrive and bolster the assault at Pont de Hoc. Yet the 40-minute postponement changed everything. Instead of reinforcing initial success, they'd arrive at Omaha Beach's Dog White sector. There they would engage in combat that might prove absolutely crucial to breaking through this murderous of all landing zones. But this alteration meant just 225 men of Force A would tackle Pont de Hoc on their own. At 7:10 in the morning, the assault boats transporting Force A finally set their course toward the true objective. Before them loomed the cliffs of Pont de Hoc, massive and vertical in the pale dawn light. Their surfaces pocked and cratered from the tremendous bombardment that had preceded the landing. Smoke continued to billow from the shattered gun emplacements crowning the ridge. The narrow beach below, perhaps 30 yards across at low tide, lay strewn with jagged rocks and explosive craters. Above stretched the cliff face itself, 100 feet of pale limestone and chalk, rising straight up like a wall. The first landing craft, designated as Number 888, carried Colonel Rudder and elements from E Company as it lurched onto the beach. The ramp dropped into knee-deep water. Rudder bolted forward first, sprinting across the exposed shoreline toward the cliff base through a torrent of machine gun fire suddenly erupting from positions high above. The Germans had shaken off the bombardment with stunning speed. They remained alive, completely alert and fully prepared. Lieutenant James Eichner, the last man to leave craft 888, would never forget those moments. I splashed down the ramp into water reaching my knees and ran across the narrow beach toward that cliff wall, which stretched before me like an entire mile, though it truly couldn't have been more than 50 to 70 yards. The Germans were pouring fire down on us, mostly machine guns, but plenty of rifle rounds too. I could hear bullets snapping through the air past my ears. Soldiers fell in the water and on the sand before reaching solid rock. The only objective in my head was reaching the cliff base, because once there, at least the Germans couldn't aim straight down at you. Across a 500-yard span, 9 landing boats released their cargo of Rangers. The rocket-propelled grappling hooks fired instantly, little puffs of smoke and flame shooting upward as the rockets launched, sending the hooks soaring toward the cliff top. Some ropes, soaked through with salt water, fell short and dropped. Others bit into the jagged cliff edge, and Rangers immediately started their ascent. The extending ladders mounted on the amphibious trucks proved completely worthless. The naval bombardment had transformed the beach into something resembling a lunar landscape, pocked with enormous craters, so the vehicles couldn't approach close enough to the cliff base. The German response came swift and terrible. Machine gun fire raked the beach and the rock face. The German MG-42s, capable of sending out 1,200 rounds every minute, created solid walls of lead. Potato masher grenades tumbled down over the cliff edge, detonating among the ascending Rangers, and the Germans deliberately rolled stones over the rim. Limestone fragments, weighing anywhere from 5 to 20 pounds, turned into lethal projectiles when falling from 100 feet. Several rangers took direct hits from falling rocks and tumbled from their ropes. Yet the rangers on the beach and still in the landing craft poured machine gun fire at any German appearing at the cliff rim. Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1 Garands created withering suppressive fire. Moreover, 2 destroyers had pushed dangerously close to shore and were hammering away with their 5-inch guns at every bunker and fortification that showed the slightest activity. The balance gradually shifted. The Germans found they couldn't maintain heavy fire on the climbers without exposing themselves to devastating return fire. At 7:25 in the morning, just 15 minutes after touchdown, the first Rangers clambered over the top. Sergeant Howell Robbie, part of E Company, was among those leading the way. He came face to face with 3 German soldiers preparing to hurl grenades down the cliff. Roby opened fire with his Thompson at point-blank range, dropping all 3 instantly. The remaining Germans retreated from the cliff edge into the elaborate trench and bunker system. Within 5 minutes, roughly 30 Rangers from Companies D and E had seized a foothold on the cliff top. Yet their elation at reaching the summit faded almost immediately. As they advanced toward the massive gun installations, moving through a wasteland of blast craters and destroyed concrete, they uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the entire force. The fortified enclosures stood vacant. The gun positions contained nothing but wooden poles, fabricated decoys painted to look like artillery from aerial reconnaissance. The 6-inch howitzers, the entire reason for this assault, had vanished. Lieutenant James Eichner, having clawed his way to the top with Rangers from E Company, raced toward gun position number 4. His initial reaction was absolute disbelief. Jesus Christ, there's no guns here. We climbed a 100-foot cliff under constant fire, lost half our men, and the damned guns aren't even here. For a moment the whole thing felt pointless. But the Rangers hadn't scaled Pont de Hoc for nothing. The guns had been relocated, yet they hadn't gone far, and they still posed a deadly threat to the invasion beaches. Colonel Rudder, having reached the top and established his command post near the point's tip, rapidly reorganized his scattered forces. The objective had shifted, but the mission remained viable. "Find those guns," he commanded. "They can't have gone far. Destroy them wherever you find them." By 7:45 in the morning, Rangers from all 3 companies had reached the summit, though at horrific cost. Of the 225 men who'd landed, approximately 35 lay dead or wounded on the beach and cliff face. Another 15 had fallen after reaching the top. This left roughly 175 Rangers to accomplish a mission originally requiring a full battalion. Companies D and E moved away from the point itself and created roadblocks along the main coastal road. This was part of their original plan, to intercept the highway and prevent German reinforcements from traveling between Utah and Omaha beaches. Staff Sergeant Len Lamel, wounded but undeterred, led his platoon to a position blocking the road roughly 200 meters south of Pont de Hoc. By 8:15 in the morning, about 35 Rangers from Companies D and E had established a defensive line along the highway. Lamel and Staff Sergeant Jack Cohen, his closest companion and acting platoon sergeant, spotted a narrow farm road branching inland from the coastal highway. The dirt track showed deep impressions as though something massive and wheeled had passed through recently. Both men arrived at an identical conclusion. The missing guns had probably left those marks. They moved forward on their own initiative and combat experience, deciding to pursue the lead. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, Lamel and Cohen advanced cautiously down the sunken country lane. This typical Norman farm track lay enclosed by 9-foot hedgerows towering on both sides. They progressed using alternating tactics, one man moving while the other watched his back. After moving roughly 250 yards south from the coastal highway, Lamel froze. Something had caught his eye through an opening in the hedge. He glanced at Cohen and spoke quietly, words destined to enter Ranger legend. "Jack, here they are. We've found them. Here are the goddamned guns." There, in an orchard covered with camouflage netting, stood 5 of the 6 missing 6-inch howitzers. They sat positioned in battery formation, barrels aimed northwest toward Utah Beach, with ammunition stacked in piles nearby. Astonishingly, no German soldiers were visible right around the guns. Across an open field roughly 100 meters distant, Lamel spotted perhaps 100 German troops, what looked to be artillerymen and gun crews, gathered in formation. They remained completely unaware that 2 American soldiers stood within grenade-throwing distance of their artillery. Lamel evaluated the circumstance instantly. He and Cohen each carried a single thermite grenade. 2 grenades wouldn't suffice to destroy 5 guns, but waiting wasn't an option. Each passing minute raised the likelihood that these guns would unleash fire on the landing beaches. He turned to Cohen. "Give me your grenade, Jack. Cover me. I'm going to take them out." While Cohen settled into position with his Thompson submachine gun ready, Lamel crawled toward the first gun. He inserted his thermite grenade into the gun's recoil mechanism, that intricate system absorbing the firing impulse. He pulled the safety pin. The thermite ignited without sound, burning hotter than 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A blazing stream of molten metal that flowed into every opening of the mechanism, welding gears together, fusing movable components into a permanently ruined mass. He placed Cohen's grenade into the rotating mechanism of the second gun and pulled its pin as well. Then, with both grenades used up, he stripped off his field jacket, wrapped it around his Thompson submachine gun's stock, and deliberately shattered the optical sights on all 5 weapons. These sights represented precision engineering, impossible to obtain or repair on the battlefield. Without functioning sights, the guns became inaccurate. The whole operation took fewer than 10 minutes before Lamel and Cohen quietly withdrew. Yet the task remained incomplete. 3 guns lay damaged, but complete destruction remained necessary. Lamel and Cohen returned to their roadblock position and immediately began gathering thermite grenades from other ranges. Nearly everyone had unused ones. In just a few moments, Lamel had collected enough grenades to fill his field jacket. Both men turned back toward the orchard. They reached the gun position around 9 o'clock. Once again, strangely, no German defenders occupied the gun site itself. Cohen moved into covering position while Lamel systematically placed thermite grenades on the 3 previously damaged guns, ensuring total destruction beyond possible salvage. He pulled each safety pin and started withdrawing. Right as he cleared the 9-foot hedgerow where Cohen crouched, everything exploded. An enormous blast threw both men backward off the hedgerow and onto the sunken lane below. Debris, dirt, shell fragments, and equipment cascaded from above. For a moment, both lay paralyzed by shock. Neither realized that Sergeant Frank Rapinski, commanding a patrol from E Company, had located an enormous German ammunition dump positioned near the gun location and had destroyed it with grenades. The explosion had been massive. At 9:05 in the morning, Lamel dispatched a messenger back to Colonel Rudder carrying a message that would determine whether the entire Pont de Hoc mission succeeded or failed. Located guns, all destroyed, mission accomplished. Rudder, whose command post endured increasing German fire, permitted himself a moment of grim satisfaction before tactical reality reasserted itself. The guns lay destroyed, the primary objective technically complete. Yet 175 Rangers found themselves isolated on a clifftop, ringed by German forces of uncertain size, ammunition dwindling dangerously, and no immediate assistance coming. Throughout the afternoon of June 6th, German counterattacks grew increasingly fierce. Squads from the 914th Grenadier Regiment probed Ranger lines. Mortar rounds pounded the roadblock positions. Snipers established firing points in the hedgerows. The observation bunker at Pont de Hoc's tip, a massive concrete fortress that had endured the naval bombardment, still housed German defenders. Rangers hurled bazooka rockets and grenades through the firing ports, but the Germans inside remained defiant. As nightfall descended on June 6th, Colonel Rudder faced his gravest decision as commanding officer. From his original 225 men, more than a third now lay dead or wounded, though many continued fighting despite injuries. Radio contact with the roadblock forces along the coastal highway remained sporadic. Ammunition had become dangerously low, particularly grenades and mortar rounds. The Germans occupied higher ground on 3 sides and were obviously preparing a major assault. British officer Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor, who'd landed with the Rangers as an observer, noted with characteristic restraint. "Never have I been so convinced of anything as that I will be either a prisoner of war or a casualty by morning." The night spanning June 6th to 7th became a desperate fight for survival. German counterattacks rolled forward in successive waves, illumination flares lit the darkness overhead, machine gun tracers crisscrossed the night. The exhausted Rangers, depleted from the climbing and the day's combat, rotated through sentry duty. Around 11 o'clock, a more serious assault developed. German soldiers, apparently company strength, moved forward from the south toward the Ranger roadblock positions. Mortar fire announced the attack. Then came the infantry assault, German soldiers advancing in short rushes. Rangers threw everything at them they possessed. Browning automatic rifles cracked with controlled bursts. M1 Garand sounded steadily. Grenades arced upward into the darkness. The Germans pushed within 50 meters of the Ranger lines before their attack finally collapsed. The defensive lines had held firm, yet the cost was devastating. 6 more Rangers lay dead. Another 10 were grievously wounded, their cries echoing through the smoke-filled positions. The ammunition situation had become dire. Those 60mm mortars were down to their final handful of rounds. When June 7th arrived, it brought a fresh wave of German assault. Wave after wave of counterattacks swept toward the Rangers from every conceivable direction. Enemy reinforcements were pouring in, particularly units from the 352nd Infantry Division. The tactical picture was spiraling toward catastrophe. Around 85 men now manned the roadblock stretching along the coastal highway. This included the 23 Rangers from the 5th Battalion who had fought their way there on the evening of June 6th. They were running out of time, the command post hugging Pointe du Hoc's perimeter, holding back German assaults from the west, had been reduced to roughly 90 defenders. Exhaustion and wounds plagued most of them. Colonel Rudder carried 2 separate wounds from the fierce fighting raging around him. He faced an agonizing choice. Should he pull his scattered companies together at Pointe du Hoc for one concentrated defensive stand, or keep that dangerous roadblock manned despite knowing it risked encirclement? He made his gamble. He would defend both positions, banking everything on the hope that American reinforcements would arrive before his isolated men were overwhelmed. This decision was born from both military calculation and the Ranger spirit itself. Their orders were explicit: hold the coastal road. That meant holding it to the end, whether rescue came or destruction found them first. June 7th brought relentless German pressure from all angles. Machine gun nests that had been bypassed during the initial assault suddenly came alive with murderous fire from unexpected positions. Marksmen seemed to be everywhere, watching, waiting, shooting. The Rangers began to realize the Germans had constructed an entire network of connecting tunnels and trenches. Enemy soldiers could vanish from one spot and reappear elsewhere in seconds. By evening on June 7th, the situation had become genuinely desperate. Ammunition reserves had nearly vanished. The last mortar rounds had been expended. Grenades were gone. Many Rangers were down to their final magazine clips, each one counting individual bullets. Water supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The medical station had exhausted its supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid posts, receiving almost no treatment. The night stretching from June 7th into June 8th brought everything to a breaking point. At midnight, the Germans launched a massive assault. This was not a probing attack or a limited incursion. This was a deliberate, coordinated battalion-strength operation designed to destroy the Rangers completely. Artillery shells thundered down on the defensive positions with punishing force. Then came the infantry. Rows of German soldiers advanced behind that artillery screen. The Rangers, measuring out their remaining ammunition with desperate care, held their fire. They waited. 50 meters. Still waiting. 40, 30. When the enemy had closed to 50 meters, the Rangers opened fire with whatever they had left. The volume of gunfire was absolutely devastating, yet the Germans kept surging forward. First, Sergeant Lommel held a section of the roadblock. He looked down and realized he had 3 rounds remaining for his Thompson submachine gun and a single grenade. German infantrymen suddenly appeared 20 meters away. He fired those last 3 rounds. The grenade left his hand. It exploded. Then he grabbed an M1 rifle from a fallen ranger beside him and kept fighting. The German assault collapsed less than 30 meters from the ranger's line. The enemy pulled back into the darkness, leaving behind scores of dead and wounded. When the Rangers took inventory of what they had left, the reality was terrifying. Across all their weapons combined, they had perhaps 100 rounds of ammunition. That was all that stood between them and annihilation. June 8th brought an almost supernatural quiet to Pointe du Hoc. German pressure simply stopped. Not because they had surrendered or lost interest, but because they were regrouping. They assumed this would be the moment for their knockout blow. The Rangers, nearly out of ammunition and running on fumes, prepared themselves for what might very well be their final stand. Around midday, lookouts spotted movement along the coastal highway to the east. A formation was approaching. Terror gripped the Rangers for several seconds. They thought surely this was another German wave, one they possessed no means to stop. Then someone shouted, "American helmets!" Rangers from the 5th Battalion were coming, along with infantrymen from the 116th Infantry Regiment and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion, advancing inland from Omaha Beach. The siege had ended. The moment those reinforcements reached Pointe du Hoc, they encountered a landscape transformed into a nightmare. The terrain was cratered and devastated beyond any easy recognition. The Rangers emerging from their positions were almost unrecognizable themselves. Mud caked their uniforms, blood streaked their faces and arms, cordite smoke hung on them like a shadow. Wounds covered many of them, exhaustion had hollowed out every eye. When the incoming units counted those who could still fight, the price of the mission became unmistakably clear. Out of the original 225 Rangers who had landed on June 6th, only 90 remained combat effective. Yet the mission itself had been accomplished. The guns were destroyed. The coastal highway had been cut. German reserves could not flow between the beaches at the precise moment when the entire invasion hung precariously in the balance. For 2 consecutive days, the Rangers had held their ground against overwhelming numerical superiority, displaying determination and combat skill that shattered every conventional expectation. Pointe du Hoc's significance extended far beyond the immediate objective. Those 6 155mm guns represented a tremendous threat to both Utah and Omaha beaches during those crucial morning hours when soldiers were most vulnerable, crowded onto the sand. Military assessments concluded those 6 operational guns, if properly directed, could have sunk or severely damaged countless landing craft and claimed thousands of lives. The roadblock prevented German mobile forces from rushing reinforcements to either beach at that critical juncture. The 904th Grenadier Regiment, committed to counter-attacking Pointe du Hoc, remained fixed there instead of moving to Omaha, where the entire outcome remained uncertain until well past midday on June 6th. Pointe du Hoc became the vindication of General Eisenhower's conviction that specially trained forces and creative tactics could accomplish what conventional operations could not. Eisenhower himself reflected on this in his post-war memoirs published in 1948. The Rangers who scaled those cliffs demonstrated the warrior spirit that would carry us to victory, he wrote. They showed that courage and initiative could overcome material disadvantage, that rigorous training and unwavering determination could overcome seemingly unbeatable positions. General Omar Bradley, in his own memoir published in 1951, spoke even more bluntly about the assault's true meaning. No soldier in my command ever faced a more demanding task than the one given to our Provisional Ranger Force commander. The fact that the Rangers succeeded was not merely a tactical victory, but proof of the American soldiers' capacity to execute what appeared impossible when leadership was sound and motivation was genuine. The Rangers themselves spoke differently about their accomplishment. When interviewed decades afterward in oral histories, the survivors consistently pointed to preparation, collective effort, and good fortune rather than individual heroism. First Sergeant Lamel, who received the Distinguished Service Cross, the British Military Medal, and the French Legion of Honor for his role in destroying the guns, always deflected personal credit. Any Ranger could have accomplished what I did, he maintained in a 1999 interview. We trained specifically for this. Jack Coon covered me while I moved. Other Rangers held that roadblock that gave us room to advance. Naval gunfire kept German forces at bay. This was not one person's victory, but an entire battalion's accomplishment. We paid too heavy a price in fallen comrades for any of us to boast about individual recognition. Pointe du Hoc itself has remained virtually untouched by time, kept as a lasting tribute to those Rangers. Cratering from the naval bombardment still scars the earth. Broken bunkers and casemates remain exactly as they were abandoned. The cliff face bears the marks of that June morning. Monuments at the cliff's edge honor both the Rangers who climbed and all the men from all nations who gave their lives on that day. 40 years after D-Day, on June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan stood at Pointe du Hoc. 62 survivors from the 2nd Ranger Battalion sat before him, the men who had climbed that day. Reagan's words that afternoon became among his most memorable speeches. Gazing at those aging Rangers from the cliff's edge, he spoke directly to them. These are the men of Pointe du Hoc. These are the ones who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped liberate a continent. These are the heroes who helped finish a war. Pointe du Hoc's lessons transcended the moment itself. The assault proved that soldiers with rigorous specialized training could accomplish objectives that conventional forces simply could not. The Ranger concept became a permanent fixture in American military organization. Today's 75th Ranger Regiment traces its heritage directly to the 2nd Ranger Battalion and considers Pointe du Hoc a cornerstone of Ranger identity. The combat methods refined for this mission influenced military strategy for generations. Yet perhaps the deepest lesson was neither tactical nor technological, but fundamentally human. The assault revealed that soldiers properly motivated and given clear direction and adequate preparation could surmount obstacles that seemed impossible. When Pointe du Hoc veterans gathered for a reunion in 1985 at Fort Hood, Texas, more than 500 former Rangers attended, many bringing their families. These men in their 60s had not gathered in decades, yet the connection forged on that cliff face proved timeless. Colonel James Rudder had passed away in 1970 after serving as president of Texas A&M University and Texas Land Commissioner. His widow, Margaret, attended the reunion and offered remarks in his memory. Jim rarely discussed Pointe du Hoc, she reflected to the assembled veterans. But I knew he carried tremendous pride in your accomplishment, and he was deeply moved by the men he lost. He told me the real heroes were the ones who never came home. First Sergeant Leonard Lomel, now 65, delivered the reunion's keynote address. We arrived at Pointe du Hoc believing we faced an impossible mission, he told them. The Germans believed the same thing, and their certainty became their fatal error. They could not imagine that anyone would attempt what we attempted, so they failed to prepare fully for our success. We discovered that day that impossible is simply difficult wearing a different name, and difficult is simply work that demands more courage and more determination than your enemy possesses. The statistics of Pointe du Hoc reveal part of the story, though numbers cannot convey everything. Of the 225 Rangers who landed on June 6th, approximately 135 were killed or wounded during those 2 days of fighting. The casualty rate surpassed 60%, among the highest for any unit engaged on D-Day. The Rangers defended their positions for roughly 48 hours while isolated and surrounded, facing enemy forces at battalion or regimental strength. The 155mm guns were destroyed approximately 3 hours after the assault began, fulfilling the primary objective despite the Germans having relocated those guns. Just 2 men using thermite grenades proved that strategic impact does not measure itself by the size of the force delivering it. The roadblock was cut and held. Not a single American or Allied ship or landing craft took fire from Pointe du Hoc's guns on June 6th, confirming the operation's strategic necessity. The human toll extended beyond those 2 days. Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc fell in subsequent operations. The 2nd Ranger Battalion fought through France and into Germany, facing horrific casualties in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. Of the 90 Rangers still combat effective on June 8th, fewer than 40 survived the entire war without suffering wounds. Pointe du Hoc's influence reaches every modern special operations organization. The 75th Ranger Regiment maintains a memorial to Pointe du Hoc at its command center. Every Ranger trainee visits Normandy as part of their preparation, standing at that cliff edge and studying the beach far below. The Ranger Creed contains words forged on that day. I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. Rangers at Pointe du Hoc demonstrated that principle repeatedly, risking their own lives to rescue wounded comrades even while under fire. For the Germans, Pointe du Hoc marked the start of catastrophe. The Atlantic Wall, which had consumed vast resources and labor to construct, had been breached at its most heavily defended position. German defenders throughout Normandy felt the psychological shock reverberating through their ranks. The 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions that held the Normandy sector were shattered in the days following June 6th. By month's end, both had effectively ceased functioning as organized fighting forces. The consequences for the wider war were profound. D-Day ultimately succeeded because operations like Pointe du Hoc succeeded. If Rangers had failed, if those 6 guns had remained active and fired into the beaches during the critical morning hours of June 6th, Omaha Beach might have faced very different results. The recognition of Pointe du Hoc's significance has evolved across decades. In 1979, France officially transferred Pointe du Hoc to the American Battle Monuments Commission for permanent preservation and care. Today, more than 400,000 visitors annually walk that ground. The memorial itself is elegantly simple, a granite block positioned atop the concrete bunker, inscribed in French and English. The English text reads, "Here on June 6, 1944, elements of the United States 2nd Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, scaled the 100-foot cliffs and destroyed the German artillery battery that threatened the landings at Omaha and Utah beaches." The assault on Pointe du Hoc represents one of the Second World War's supreme demonstrations of military courage and tactical brilliance. It succeeded because men committed to accomplishing the mission refused to entertain failure. The Germans were correct that the cliffs seemed nearly impossible to take from the sea, yet they completely misjudged the training, determination, and combat skill of Rangers willing to attempt it. The Rangers possessed justified confidence in their ability to accomplish what was asked, though the cost proved steeper than anticipated. 6 guns were destroyed, the coastal highway was cut, the invasion succeeded. That success came at an enormous price, written in the wounds and deaths of 135 Rangers. The transformation of impossible into difficult into accomplished tells the entire story. It started with a German defensive position that appeared unbeatable. It continued with American planners refusing to accept that unbeatable meant impossible. It reached its climax with 225 Rangers climbing 100 feet of vertical rock face under fire, because their training had prepared them for exactly that mission, because their orders demanded it. The Rangers who survived built lives in the decades that followed, yet the memory of fallen comrades remained always present. As survivors gradually grew fewer with passing years, those who remained increasingly understood their responsibility to preserve and share this history. The Pointe du Hoc story continues being written. The cliffs remain standing, the memorial endures, and the testament of 225 men lives on. They demonstrated that through rigorous training, authentic courage, and unwavering determination, no position is unassailable, no cliff unclimbable, no objective unreachable.